Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and I'm here with Mike Simmons, co-founder of Catalyst Sale. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Jody.
Mike, we've had something interesting show up over the course of the time we've been doing this show that surprised me a little. Maybe it shouldn't, but I've heard from a lot of people who listen to the show that aren't active sales professionals. Now, by that, I mean people that are going out with their grip, or what's the word you use when you go out with your briefcase?
Carrying a bag.
Carrying a bag. Okay, people that aren't actively carrying a bag. They listen to the show and they enjoy it. Why do you think the Catalyst Sale Podcast is attractive to people who aren't directly active sales professionals?
I think sales is a bit of a black box where people don't really know what's inside it. It's a little bit intriguing. They've got their own preconceived notions about what sales is. They've seen movies like Tommy Boy. They've seen Glengarry Glen Ross, and they read a book like Death of a Salesman, or see the play Death of a Salesman. So I think there's an interest level, and there's some negative connotations with the role that are out in the marketplace. All of that being said, I think that people realize that everybody sells in one way or another. We're trying to get the people we work with, we're trying to get them to trade their time for our time. We may want to gather information from them, gather knowledge, like in the learning space. I know we've got a number of learning professionals who listen to the podcast. There are folks there who are constantly trying to find subject matter experts and constantly trying to get those subject matter experts to share the insight on their individual roles that they can incorporate into the learning that they're designing. So I think there's some correlations between that role and those activities and what we do as sales professionals. So hopefully the people who've listened to the podcast have started to see the role be a bit demystified.
That leads me to what I think would be a really interesting topic. We talk sales every episode, but for the most part, at least in my mind, we've always really been talking to people that are carrying a bag. But what if we talked this time about sales for non-sales professionals?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and it's one that we discuss with organizations. We actually hold workshops where we talk about this topic, and we work to, and I said the phrase earlier, demystify sales. A lot of times that's about the vocabulary that's being used. So, yep, I am game for the discussion.
Okay, so let's just start basic, just right at the top. What comes to mind when I say that to you, sales for non-sales professionals?
Well, I mean, the first thing I want to know is what's the context? What's the role? Where's the question coming from? And I know I mentioned learning before, and I know that we've got a number of people out there, a number of the people who are listening to this now are in learning roles, whether they're instructional designers, whether they're running learning programs inside an organization. So let's take it from that perspective. Sales is, if you just define sales is the activity that leads toward generating a business transaction, an opportunity to generate business for, in most cases, for the companies that you work with. And success is usually measured by the dollars that are generated. Sometimes success is measured by the number of people who get exposed to your product or your platform. It depends on where you are in that journey. And other times it's measured purely by the number of organizations that you're able to bring in to your customer base. So sales, when I think about it, is driven by a number, and that number could either be a financial number, revenue that you're bringing into the organization. It could be a number of companies, or it could be number of people.
You mentioned earlier, at least I think you did, maybe you've just said it to me in the past, that we're all in sales. So what do you mean by that? If you've given one example of a type of person that's not a sales professional that listens to this show. So if we have different roles. We're not a traditional salesman or salesperson. What do you mean that we're all in sales?
When I think of it in that context, I think of trading. And earlier we talked a little bit about trading time. You're, as a learning professional, trading time with a subject matter expert. As a marketing professional inside your organization, you're trading time with a member of the sales team in order to gather insight from them, maybe share some insight with them, get a better understanding of the work that they do, maybe help them better understand the work that you do. Anytime that someone spends time sitting with you, they have made a choice to not do something else. In order to justify that time, you need to be able to articulate the value to the person on the other end. The value to the person on the other end may purely be a relationship that they're building. The value to the person on the other end may purely be that they are sharing information that'll help you do your job better, which in turn will help the organization do their job better. So that's an example internally. Another example is when you're out talking to people. They're the people you see at the grocery store. They're the people you see at the movie theater. They're the people that you see at the beach. They're the people you see at the ice cream shop. When you're talking to people out in the community, you get a sense for challenges that they might be running into. You may be able to help them address that challenge through someone in your network or through the company that you work for. Let's say you are talking to somebody who's struggling and building up a business, and they're managing everything through spreadsheets, and you just happen to work for a CRM company. You might be able to help them solve that problem as you understand it. So I think, and it's just, there's very few barriers between people out there at different levels in an organization and the customers. There's always a chance to interact with customers. And if you think of it from the mentality of, I'm trying to help those customers solve a problem, then you're helping them get to a solution and you're in sales.
I think there's a couple of ways to look at this as we talk about sales for non-sales professionals. And with what you described right there, so few barriers between. So I think that's one. If you are, I don't know, pick a role, like you're an accountant even, and you draw the line from what you do to the customer, or you're, say, a staff accountant at an organization, then you can start to say, okay, I've got to keep the books in line so the salespeople can do what they need to do, right? You can start drawing that line. So that's one. If the ultimate goal is to provide a solution for a customer, then we're all in sales because that's where the line draws. And then I think the other is that you're in sales because you have outcomes you're trying to achieve, and you will always need help from other people to achieve that. And it does take sales to make that happen. And Mike and I are both parents, so you can draw that line. Well, geez, we're always trying to sell to our kids and to our spouse. That's one way to look at it. But then at work, if you're always trying to sell to coworkers to get help, to your supervisor, if you've got an idea and you want to make it happen. So speak to that aspect a little bit of sales.
I think what you're talking about there is influence. So how do you influence others in their decision-making process? How do we, as parents, influence our kids to be thoughtful in the decisions that they make, or they think before they act is a common phrase around our household. We want the kids to think before they act. So influence is really important here. And in order to influence, communication is really important. Listening is really important. Empathy is really important. These are all skills that will help you be a better sales professional, or the sales professionals tend to be good at these skills. So I think when you mention that, Jody, I think of influence. I think another path to take the discussion down is really more to the vocabulary path. I mean, there are words that you'll hear. You started it off today when you started talking about what the saying for carrying a briefcase or carrying a bag. There are terms that you'll hear that folks who are not in the sales professional may be unfamiliar with.
Well, I want to step back to influence for a moment, because that really got me thinking differently about this. That probably is the proper word over sales, but by calling it sales and not influence, it ties a little more directly to the show, I guess. We've talked before how I used to be a law enforcement park ranger. And I think of a lot of those situations, and you always wanted to practice influence before you had to use your authority. Because if you could get somebody to do what needed to be done through influence rather than actually using your authority, which you, as a law enforcement officer, you have the legal right to do, but things always went better with influence. And so as you talked about influence, it all started lining up a little bit better for me. And we can get better at influence by understanding how sales relationships work, I think, because I'm looking back at episodes we've done of this show, and so much of what it takes to lead to a sale really is building influence. Because if you don't have the ability to influence somebody else, you are not going to have the ability to show them what you are selling is the solution to their problem.
Yeah. And I mean, when you think about influence, it requires that you listen, that you take in information, that you can digest that information, and then you can deliver that thing, whatever that, maybe it's the solution, deliver that solution in the context of what's important to the individual. If someone doesn't need gas in their car for whatever reason, it's going to be hard to sell them gas. But if you hear, and I know this sounds pretty hokey, but if you know that they're in the process of going on a long trip, and there's a chance that they're going to be out in the middle of the wilderness, going to your park ranger example, and they might be in a situation where they're going to be far enough away from a gas station, it may be really valuable for them to have an extra gas can that they have in the vehicle as an alternative way to fuel the vehicle if they run out of gas, as an example. So influence is really important, and it requires good listening skills. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, empathy.
Yeah, what you were talking about reminded me, sometimes all it takes to influence me to make a stop is if I'm on the highway and I see a sign that says last gas station or facilities, whatever, for 62 miles. Right? Just the right words at the right time to the right person can even influence them to take action. So there's one last place I want to take this. We're talking sales for non-professionals. So what are the key elements of sales that you feel are most important to non-sales professionals?
I don't know that it's elements of sales that are important to non-sales professionals. I think this gets back into a discussion around vocabulary. So for people who aren't in sales, I don't know that you really need to be a good sales practitioner. I don't know that this is something where you want to go through the process of understanding all of the components of a sales cycle, a traditional sales cycle or sales process. I don't know that you need to go through the technical components of objection handling or negotiation or proposal writing or any of these other things. I do think it's important, though, that you understand the vocabulary that people use inside the organization. Some things like quota. Quota is what the sales professional's target for a given year. Depending on how your organization is structured, you may have a quota for a line of business or for a specific VP inside the organization or specific geography. And then that person has multiple members of their team who have a roll-up quota, a roll-up set of objectives that meet the overarching number for the business unit. And then the business unit helps to meet the overarching number for the organization. Quota at an individual level, when you hear people talk about it, that's their target, either for an individual, a month, a quarter, or a given year. And this is the 1 and 0, the black and white metric that they measure success against. They either are above plan or have hit their quota, above their quota, or they're below plan. If they're below plan, the sales professionals inside your organization may be at risk of losing their job. And this is where the stress of sales comes in. If they're above plan, they're likely in that situation where they're hitting accelerators or they're seeing higher commission rates. But when you hear people talk about quota, quota is the financial metric that they're measured on. I've seen other organizations where they look at quota as a number of individuals who sign up for a product. So it's not based on a financial number. It's based on an eyeballs number, a number of eyes who see the product. I've also seen in early stage organizations where those numbers are based on logos that they generate and bring into the organization. But when you hear people talk about quota, that's ultimately the number that the individual rep, sales manager, or sales leader is responsible for. Another data point that comes up are like activity metrics. Sometimes you'll hear a sales organization talk about activity metrics, and we've talked about that a couple of different times in the podcast. These activity metrics could be things like number of calls that they have with a customer, number of proposals that they deliver into an organization, number of demos that they facilitate with an organization. Those activity metrics are important from the standpoint that they could be looked at as leading indicators to help demonstrate success inside an organization. But most companies will come back to the financials, the hard and fast numbers of, did we meet the number this year? Because if we, as a company, do not hit the number that we're targeting, we no longer, it has implications on budget availability throughout other aspects of the organization. If we are 20% below plan, we may need to cut in different areas of the organization to reduce expenses. That might be reducing the number of products that we're able to ship, functions that we're able to ship out in our product. It might mean reducing headcount inside the sales organization or inside another group inside the organization. It may lead to other decisions, maybe reducing expense around marketing or promotion, or may bring additional attention to how those expenses are incurred.
Mike, as we begin to wind this one down, what final words or thoughts do you have about sales for non-sales professionals?
I think the key here, and I've got a couple of additional things that I think we'll want to get into, but I think the key here is, like any other role inside the organization, take the time to ask people questions about what they're doing in the organization, how they go about doing their job, where they get information from, how they measure success. Know that the individuals inside your organization who are focused on sales, who are measured on that number, if they're talking to you, they're not talking to customers, and rarely are you buying from them. So it may be harder to get on their calendar. It doesn't mean that they don't want to share information. It doesn't mean that they don't want to help out. It doesn't mean that they don't want to be engaged. Just know that there may be other priorities that they have to focus on. I think the key piece there when you're involved in those conversations is ask questions. Ask questions related to your specific role in the organization. If you're focused on customer service or customer success, ask yourselves, the people in your sales organization, questions about what they're hearing from their customer base when it comes to areas for improvement around customer success, customer service, and delivering value into the organization. Know that there are certain periods of time throughout the year where it's going to be really hard to get a salesperson's attention, and other times where it's going to be a little bit easier to get their attention. Try to get a sense for the seasonality of your business. If you're in academic, or you're a company that sells into the academic space, it's probably going to be really tough to get a hold of your sales team in the months of May and June and July because of the budget availability at the state level in that vertical or in that market. If you're inside an organization where your primary audiences are large B2B companies whose fiscal years end in the calendar year, know that it's probably going to be hard to get time and attention from the sales team in November, December, and January. Try to find those gaps in the year where business starts to slow down, where they're going to have more time to get engaged with you. And just remember, salespeople are people too. They ask a lot of questions, they gather information, they can be really direct. All of those things help when they're communicating with customers, and they can help with communication internally.
All right, Mike, this has been a good talk. And I think that it's been a good look at why sales and influence is important to all of us. And my favorite part was when you talked about how few barriers there are between your role and the customer, no matter what your role is. So thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for listening to Catalyst Sale. If you want to reach out to us, you can find pretty much everything we're up to at catalystsale.com, but we're also on Twitter and LinkedIn, so you can find us there. Thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.